Hi everyone, I'm Rujuta and I'm a co-chair for TechWomen Alumni Council this year. And as part of our reaching out to the TWAC community, we are doing monthly webinar series. And I'm going to go ahead right in and introduce today's speaker, Reshma Singh. Reshma Singh served as a program director of US Department of Energy's Tech to Market IMPEL program. She manages the California Energy Commission's R2M2 microgrid program and previously the President's US-India Bilateral Center for Building Energy Research and Development at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. So she has over 10 years of experience in advanced urban sustainability, clean tech building innovations, and working in complex international ecosystems in US, India, and Singapore. Some of you might already know Reshma because she has served for 3 years on TechWomen Alumni Council, and she invites you to committing yourself to creating a change in the world to join the platform Climate Smart Tech Women. With that, handing over to you, Reshma.
Thank you to Shagufta, Rujuta, Mohana, Heather, and of course to IIE. And of course to all of you powerful women leaders who are here today. I realize that some of you are waking up at odd hours in the night. For some of you fellows, it's the middle of the night right now. So I'm so glad that you're here to be part of the discussion today. While the TechWomen STEM community comes from a pretty powerful and strong background of science, technology, engineering, and math, I think we also realize as we meet each other year after year that we come from very strong faiths and a very strong commitment to do something good for each other and for the planet. A lot of us come from a strong drive for social justice and environmental justice while doing our day jobs with our science fields and technology fields. So in terms of today's webinar, it's really kind of a stream of consciousness to talk about some of the key challenges of our time. But I want to use this as a platform as a way to share our honest experiences, to talk about ideas going forward, and it's intentionally being kept conversational. So the first half an hour is going to be a series of slides just talking about what has been on top of my mind in the past few months. And then I'm hoping that in the second half an hour, we can open up a dialogue, make it really interactive, and launch perhaps initiatives that are important for today's times. All right, so I want to start with one of my favorite people and one of the most well-known figures in the environmental movement, Rachel Carson. So she was, as this Time magazine cover says, she was a force of nature. She basically wrote a series of books. She was a biologist from Johns Hopkins, and she wrote a series of books way back in just after the World War happened. And one of the most powerful books she's written is called Silent Spring, where she talks about the use of DDT. I think a lot of us know DDT, which is an insecticide, and for the Allied forces in the World War II, many soldiers were saved thanks to this insecticide. It was supposed to be this miracle kind of product, and in fact the Swiss scientist who invented DDT was even given the 1948 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. But she was the first one to think about not just human beings but what's beyond the human being and what's kind of the broader systemic role of something that we produce as human beings in nature. And she called it out for what it was. She basically called out DDT and said it's killing the birds, it's killing the ecosystem, and she was the first one to raise her voice about it. So I think she is a solid example. She's called the mother of the environmental movement because she started to think about human beings within a larger ecosystem. And her words, the more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe, the less taste we will have for its destruction holds true now more than ever. I think Rachel Carson is a pretty well-known figure to everybody, at least in the Western world, and I'm sure there's a lot of environmental movements happening across some of the countries where our fellows come from, but I think she's been a very powerful figure. So let's move to grounding ourselves on why we're here today. So It's indeed an unprecedented time in history. There's a lot going on in the world today, many intertwined threads. There's a health pandemic, there's racial tensions, political divisiveness at the tipping point, economic recession, climate events, kind of all of these things going on in the world. And COVID 19 is kind of at the center of all of this. It's taken a huge toll on physical health, economic health, and mental health of people. So, one of our fellows, Rasha, Sukaria, she was supposed to join the conversation today. She wrote on her Facebook profile that, I'll quote her, she's a Tech Woman Fellow from 2017. The word grief has been going around since the pandemic has started. The most unfortunate of us have grieved the loss of loved ones, and the most fortunate ones have grieved the loss of romantic relationships, exciting summer schools, or very simply, the chance of seeing the comforting, familiar faces of family members and friends. So, at the very least, all of us have felt some kind of mental stress thanks to this pandemic. In fact, there's been some um, studies which show that three-quarters of Americans report anxiety and half of Americans feel lonely. And there's another report, actually several reports into healthcare staff, that three-quarters of healthcare staff report feeling distressed or depressed. So, as 7 million people across the world have been affected with the pandemic, 400,000 lives have been lost, communities are scrambling to fight this double onslaught of the mental health crisis. So, you know, vaccines and medicines aside, ventilators aside, I think the cure is more than this. A deeper, longer term healing is definitely required. So, what does this mean for us? Um, this means that, over half of the world's population, 4.5 billion people, have been in complete or partial lockdowns in the past few months. Shelter in place has been pretty effective, and a study was released just today which showed that about 60 million people have been saved from getting infected thanks to the lockdown. So that has been a silver lining. But this lockdown has also given us a chance, another silver lining, to be able to pause and reflect. In our fast paced lives, we don't usually have that much time to pause and reflect. So it's kind of a godsend that if we're not being able to go out, we start going in, right? Many of you may have seen that, little meme which says, if you can't go out, go in. And another thing that a lot of, articles are reporting is people have started to believe again in the power of prayer. So, a Pew Research Center survey in March found that more than half Americans were praying for the coronavirus to end. And we also know that prayers help to quell and calm the mind. And I quote from an article in the Wall Street Journal. Gillian Richardson has a new routine when she takes a walk. She puts on a mask, pops in her earbuds, and heads out the door. Then she starts talking out loud. Dear God, help me to stay grounded and grateful in stressful times. Show me how I can be of most service to you and others. So I think all of us are finding a shift out, towards prayer, towards being able to calm our minds, and it is indeed a time to pause and reflect. So my question to you, and I'm kind of going to open this up to a quick reflection here, and I invite all of you to share either by typing onto your chat screens, or if one of you, if you want to share in verbally. Um, when you pause and reflect, and when you're looking at your inner landscape, sometimes what helps is if you go out to the outer landscape and out to nature and you start connecting with nature. So, my question is, do you connect with nature, and why do you connect with nature?
Gupta says for internal peace.
Hi Reshma, this is Minnie. I can speak.
Go ahead. Maybe.
Nature can be very forgiving and it's very therapeutic to be connected to nature. I do that all the time. I tell all my friends, oh, when I have worries, I just walk and among trees and they seem to take all my worries away.
That resonates with me completely. Anybody else want to share?
Just makes you feel like everything is going to be okay.
Yeah. Can I share?
Yes, Rekha, go ahead.
Hi. Hi there. So I think when you go internally, you realize you're part of something much bigger than yourself, and nature gives you that part of much bigger. That's what I think. You feel part of something much bigger, and you realize you can. Oh, am I muted? Okay,
No,
sorry.
no, we can hear you.
Okay. So
Yeah, I mean that is completely true too, because it's a feeling of awe that you're part of belonging of something which is much bigger than yourself, and maybe there's something bigger that is seeming right, even though things around you might be seeming wrong.
right. Well said, Reshma.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, if you see my response, my knee jerk is not, let me go for a hike, let me go for a walk. My knee jerk is turning to music and art. But I think it is something that's bigger than yourself. I think that's it. It's whether it's nature, whatever it is, it's reaching out to something bigger than yourself and awe-inspiring, that helps us expand from our tiny little hamster cage.
Absolutely. Well said, Sean. So I think there are a lot of people who have sent chat messages, and I'm just looking at them, and they're all beautiful because I think uh, art, music,
You
uh,
want to read them out
sounds,
aloud?
sounds. Sure, Rujita, go for it.
Because we are recording it and maybe chats may not be part of it.
Mhm.
Hannah says to let my son be himself and explore without the bounds and even comforts of indoor condition, which rings like really true right now.
Yeah.
Linda says there is something special about the sound, smells, it's very centering and you feel more connected. Lakshmi says, because the external silence you find in nature amplifies internal noise of what you're wrestling with, which is awesome. Shachi says, to realize our place in vast universe, to understand we are such a minuscule part of it. And Rasha says it helps clear her mind from stressful ideas.
That's awesome. I think we all connect with nature at so many different levels. There's kind of the physical level. Serotonin gets released when you go out to nature. There is the emotional connect that you belong in nature. There's a microcosm within you which connects to the macrocosm. There's also the intellectual connect. For me as a scientist, I feel like when I go and look at flowers and the fractal geometry in the way flower buds actually bloom, or as an architect, when I look at the golden mean and the spiral of the conch shell, I think that's like at a very intellectual level also I'm connecting. So there's many different ways. In fact, there is a friend of mine, Lakshmi, who's also joined today. She kind of awakened me to the fact that there is also a neurological kind of thought process behind why we connect with nature, and I would love to have Lakshmi say something later, but I wanted to kind of talk about how our different brain parts connect with nature. So there is a broader arc of evolution and science in the way we perceive things, our cognition. So this is more of a cognitive model more than a neurological model. But over millennia, our brains have become bigger. And we started with the most basic reptilian brain, which is kind of just your instinctive unconscious brain, which evolved to the what's called the lizard brain or the amygdala, which is your food, fight, flight, and fuck, of course. And then there's the limbic system, which is emotions. And then the most evolved conscious rational brain is a neocortex, and we continuously kind of going between these different parts of our brain. So if you look at some of the protests going on and the anger that all of us are feeling with what's happening in the world, that's very much part of our limbic system. When we run or when we go to save ourselves, it's a lot of it is a flight. But then when you are meditating or praying or connecting to nature, a part of your brain lights up, which is the neocortex, and that's kind of what is your connection to the one consciousness. So a lot of people here said you feel like you belong to something bigger, and I think that's kind of the consciousness that you feel connected to you. So your conscious, rational brain becomes part of the larger consciousness. So that's just kind of a background to what I wanted to kind of leave you with, is that if we are kind of thinking about the brain, and you know we do see kind of a connectedness with the brain, and the connectedness with the environment is also happening, with the nature is also happening at different parts of the brain, at lower and higher planes of consciousness. Our faiths, our religions have also tapped into this complex web of connectedness. So just this spring, we celebrated at least 4 festivals from different faiths. Easter, Ramadan, Vaisakhi, Passover, and each of these, in fact, most faiths have a deep foundational connect between spirituality and nature. There is a deep respect that most of the teachings address in terms of stewardship of nature, in terms of humanity being a part of nature. So these are just some quotes I've taken from 4 religions, 4 faiths, and I think this is pretty universal across all faiths. So that's kind of the faith angle. But what I want to also bring in is the science angle. So in terms of just looking at science-based stewardship, right? So we looked at the faith-based stewardship. But if you look at the data, there was a very hard-hitting report, a landmark report released in 2018, which is the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. It basically states that future anthropogenic greenhouse gases, which is basically human-created greenhouse gases, the emissions would lead to a warming of 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And without rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society, our world will reach a 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is supposed to be the tipping point for our world, much sooner than we think, which is going to increase the climate events, the floods, the heat waves, the droughts. The scary part is that if we don't do it right now, it'll be irreversible by 2030. So we literally have 10 years to undo our environmental destruction. So global emissions have to be cut down by 50% by 2030 to save ourselves from the cataclysmic effects of climate change. Well, are we doing that? Well, we're doing pretty much the opposite, right? So, but the report also talks about, alternative scenarios which can stabilize the global temperature increase below 1.5 degrees Celsius versus the higher levels. And if we do that, we can actually pretty much help save what we have right now. So, let's look at how COVID has impacted the environment. So the pandemic has definitely affected 7 million people worldwide and 400,000 deaths, which is awful. But there's been a small silver lining out of this. So it has actually cut down people's commutes, air travel, manufacturing, power generation, shipping, to a level that we've actually dropped 17% just in the first month of April alone. So if you look at the air traffic and decrease in carbon monoxide levels, you'll see that this year, if we continue to shelter in place the way we have, we will be on track to decrease by 7% emissions for the rest of the year. And if we continue the 7 to 8% emissions, we will be on track to reach our 50% emissions target by 2030. But is that really going to happen? It's not likely to last, because as soon as the economy starts booming again, we are going to, start going back to our old habits. Another thing that we've seen with the COVID situation is with people going off the roads and providing wildlife a chance to really reclaim urban areas. But this is a little bit of a, I would say, an emotional connect out here. Though we are seeing wildlife coming out. You can see the coyote out in the Golden Gate area, the lions out in South Africa, the peacocks out in New Delhi. That's actually a picture sent by a cousin of mine. But I think these are kind of little, I think people are trying to find meaningfulness in the situation. So they're taking these pictures. They're not like broadly cross-cutting features which are happening. Wildlife isn't really coming out worldwide and reclaiming. This is just some instances which are nice to have. Another thing which we are noticing is that the COVID situation has reduced the year's pollution by about 4%. So quarantining and lockdowns have forced many countries' industries to shut down. Wuhan, Delhi, Los Angeles have seen the cleanest air on record. Air pollution actually claims 7 million lives every year. And nitrogen dioxide, which is a major air pollutant, is very much linked to factory smoke and vehicular emissions on the roads, which is also, and nitrogen dioxide is also a very good indicator of global economic activity. Particulate matter is also down by 60%, PM 2.5. And on the right side, you can see a picture of the Himalayas, which could not be seen from the state of Punjab for over 30 years. And because of the reduced local air pollution and the cleaning up of the air, you can actually see the Himalayas from Gurdwara in Punjab, which is, unheard of. So the question is, are these going to be short-term gains, or will all of this be for nothing? So, we did start with a drastic drop in fossil fuel energy demand. It was thanks to gas, oil, coal going down, natural gas going down. And interestingly, renewable energy have been the most resilient energy source because of the distributed nature of renewable energy. So while we don't need to have centralized power plants working and doing all the SOx, NOx emissions, renewable energy has become a pretty resilient way of dealing with energy requirements. And as I mentioned, this record 7 to 8% CO2 reduction has given a boost towards Paris Agreement goals. So if we continue what we have achieved in 2020, which is due to a forced change in behavior, but if we can actually take this forced change of behavior and really make it our own and take charge of it, we might be able to really get to those levels that we want to get to. So I'm going to play a short video here, just talking about, the whole COVID. I'm hoping that the video will work, so give me one moment.
People from Beijing to Delhi to Los Angeles have noticed bluer skies and less haze as lockdowns were imposed for the pandemic. But this year is still on track to be the hottest year on record. Why is the air getting cleaner yet warmer? Satellite observations of nitrogen dioxide, a byproduct of burning fossil fuels, show that levels of that air pollutant are going down. Clear skies also tell us that there's less particulate matter in the air. Particles are tiny bits of soot and other substances floating in the air. Particles reflect away sunlight, so paradoxically, fewer particles might mean more warming. But while those pollutants stay in the air for days, the heat-trapping gas carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere for centuries. Carbon dioxide levels will only stabilize when emissions fall into a net zero balance with sinks of the gas, like vegetation and oceans. Even with declines in CO2 this year, the Earth is nowhere near achieving that balance.
Okay, so that's just kind of a humbling reminder that things are not all rosy. Just going to try and go back to another reflection which I want to have is, do you feel strongly about the environment? We all said that we resonate with the environment. It does a lot for us. Do we feel strongly that we want to take charge and do something meaningful with the environment now that we've come to a place of pause? Again, if somebody wants to share their opinion.
Well, Reshma, maybe I can share a little. It was a couple weeks ago, it was like early Friday that I was going up to pick up my son from his father's house. And in the past, before this pandemic, I'd sit in traffic for an hour and a half sometimes after work, and just seeing the pollution and seeing the habits and feeling very much like stuck in the way that urban landscape has forced us to travel in cars and to pollute, and that it's out of a lot of people's hands whether they care about the environment or not. And then to have the pandemic where I can get my son in 15 minutes was just really delightful. And I felt very much privileged to have a car and be able to do that. And also really happy to see the environment clean up. And the day that I didn't even think to check traffic and all of a sudden traffic was bad again, I actually cried on my way up because I saw just this. It was a moment of reflection of humans are such creatures of habit, and here we go again. The moment things clean up, we're all back in traffic. And then since then, I've kind of calmed down and really felt like, no, I'm not going to just let that be the answer. If I care and if we see so much empowerment on other fronts, we can still do that for the environment. It comes down to political activity, like reaching out to people in power and not just kind of complaining to each other. So for me, I care deeply, but it's taken me a lot to try and understand what I can do beyond just my own job and passion for being outside.
Right. Yeah.
Hey, this is
So-
Meg. Oh,
Go ahead.
one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot related to the environment and pandemic with the pandemic is food supply chains. And it's been interesting how, at times it's been a lot easier and more comfortable to get food from a CSA than it has to get food from a grocery store, especially things like produce or fresh food, where you don't know how many people have touched it or who's in the grocery store going through things. And definitely just the stories about animals that have been slaughtered because the whole part of the chain is broken at these big pharma companies, big agricultural companies versus, small local farms that are finding better ways to adjust and have actually increased a lot of their production and gotten a lot more customers. So going forward for me, that's a big piece of thinking about where food comes from, both in terms of how that affects the environment and also just in terms of consumption.
Yeah, these are huge issues, absolutely huge issues. And in
Yeah.
fact, I just want to also mention that, sorry, somebody else wants to say something?
Oh, yeah. So, well, I work on climate change. I mean, that's my job. And I am really hopeful about, we do a lot. I work for the city of San Francisco, but we are international leaders on climate change, right? And so the whole idea of circular economy and supply chains, and particularly our food supply and the relationship between our food and climate change. And I think that people are getting that. I think as people see things like thousands and thousands of pigs being slaughtered and fields and fields of onions that are just rotting out there, I think it's made people much more aware of a lot of our food supply chain issues. I mean, that's just one piece of what's happened with all of this. So, it hasn't made me more aware of what's going on in the climate because that's what I do, but it's made me really hopeful that other people are more aware of a lot of these things. And that's really exciting for me. And I also hope what comes out of this is that we're much more aware of frontline workers, right? And this will give us the impetus to, in fact, make this just transition that we've been talking about for a really long time as we move into a green economy, because people are so much more aware. So I go up and down, but for the moment, I've been feeling pretty positive about what's going to come out of this.
That's great. Thanks, Sean. We should probably have a discussion offline on this as well. So kind of going back to, the consequences. So we saw that there was definitely this unintended consequence of air pollution reduction, but there are some not so great things coming out of this. So for example, in the Amazon rainforest, which is supposed to be the lungs of the earth, 25% of the CO2 emissions on earth are actually absorbed by the Amazon forest, and it harbors about 10% of the world's species. But using the distraction of COVID, there's been a lot of illegal land use change, forest destruction for cattle ranching, mining, logging. And cattle ranching, we have 1 billion, almost 1 billion cattle on earth right now. That's pretty much like, and don't get me wrong, I'm not against having cattle on earth. It's the fact that they're being raised to get slaughtered for us, right? And the fact that, yes, we have carbon emissions, but methane is also a huge issue, and that's also causing about 16% of the methane is coming from the cows. So there's a lot of intertwined effects out here. Um, Again, one other thing which is coming to light now is that there's been explosion in single-use plastics or non-biodegradable materials, medical and contaminated waste. So, yes, on one hand, we've seen pollution levels go down, wildlife come and reclaim, some emissions reduction, but there are other also flip side of the COVID situation, which is not great for the environment at all. We also kind of gearing up towards extremely heightened climate global events and the hottest year in recorded weather science. So, um, just on Sunday, we've seen tropical storm Cristobal come in Louisiana. So, all of this is still happening. So we're being kind of whammied in all directions out here. So the question is, yes, we have seen some carbon emissions reductions, but past crises, if you look at history, whether it was the end of World War II, the oil embargo in the 1970s, or the financial crisis in the 2000s, they have all led to CO2 reductions, but the world has rebounded really badly back from it, and we've seen that carbon emissions reductions have not been stabilized at pre-rebound levels. So my question today is this environmental silver lining here to stay? And if we did want to have it stay for a bit and be a little bit more, I would say, long term, how do we do it? And eventually it comes down to my question about how do we use the underpinnings of faith and science to deliver the long-term goals. So, for example, if the economy comes roaring back, can we benchmark today to be a baseline and count this year to be a time when we did roll back emissions? Do we have two levers out here? We have science and we have faith. And there's so much power in the intersection of science, faith, and environment. So can we consciously connect our belief, be it data-based, science-based with science underpinnings, or be it be foundations of faith? So now that we're taking the time to reflect and pause, can we use nature, science, and faith as a way to move ahead? I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts. First is there are certainly a bunch of faith-based organizations. There's Goodland that's doing faith and landscape stewardship. They're doing GIS mapping and looking at image data to see how churches are doing stewardship of the land that is owned by them. There is Mitzvah Day, which is a day of Jewish-based social action, and the 2019 theme was actually tackling climate change. There are other organizations like EcoSick or Bhumi. There are organizations all across which are faith-based organizations which are doing quite a lot of work to kind of get the broader consciousness of stewardship. And there are definitely individual efforts for climate action. So if you look at the whole spectrum of what we could do, there are some actions which will cause larger impact and some actions which will cause lower impact. So for example, if we upgrade our light bulbs, very tangible, very easy, cost-effective thing to do. Yes, it does make a difference in the climate change and climate action, but is it as much as eating a plant-based diet? Maybe not. So it's time to start thinking about what is it on our individual efforts that will cause more of climate action to happen. Another thing that we need to think about is beyond our own individual selves. We have to realize that our vulnerable communities are facing huge health crisis, jobs crisis, climate crisis. In fact, the poorest 50% are only responsible for 10% of the consumption-related emissions, and the richest 10% are all of us are basically responsible for half of the world's lifestyle consumption emissions. So when you're looking at our vulnerable communities which are going through this triple whammy, what can we do in terms of climate and environmental justice? Now look at the national leadership, women, powerful leaders. And if you just look at their, let's say, coronavirus response, Angela Merkel in Germany, she is a scientist by training, and she's taken the data hard on. She was the first one to be completely transparent about the fact that 70% of Germans will be affected by the virus, and she put into place the right kind of testing and protocols to squash the COVID situation. If you take the Prime Minister of Norway, she took a very empathetic and faith and love based approach. She actually started to roll out these press conferences with only children. So she would not have adults come in, but children would attend the press conferences, and she would tackle their questions. It is okay to feel scared, and her hope was that through awareness building right at the level of education of children are the one who could actually affect families much more than adults could. So there's different ways of leadership, and I think that uh, Chancellor Merkel also comes from a very strong foundation of Christian faith. There are other leaders at the national and community levels who come from different faiths, who can take charge and use faith and different brands of leadership to affect both the health and the climate crisis. Another way of doing this is if we, as Hannah mentioned, can we go out and use our political vote to see if we can somehow affect providing green strings for corporate bailouts. For example, the entire automobile industry or even the aviation industry, while they've been given some bailouts, can we actually get them to sign on to like stronger climate commitments? At the municipal level, at our city level, can we, join our local governments to see how we can reclaim land back for bicycle lanes, going away from the dreaded autocracy of the car, right? I mean, a century ago, we barely had any cars in the streets. Can we go back to a healthier lifestyle? And then can we actually get to sustainable buildings? We all thinking about going back to work. Can our buildings be healthier? Can we not be completely reliant on these highly toxic refrigerant-based HVAC solutions? Can we go back to having more fresh air in our buildings? How can we get sustainable buildings back to reclaim our health? So basically, my question is, again, going back to this nexus between environment, faith, and science. We saw what was happening during the World War II, which was the biggest war we saw before this. We're seeing what's happening with our climate and health crisis happening today. What can we do as women leaders of the future? Can we take charge? Can we take control? And can we really rewrite history and take this moment of pause and reflection, our connection with nature, our connection to faith, and our connection to science to do something more meaningful and historic and leave a legacy?